Hi, I'm Sarah Carden, and I am the policy advocate at Farm Action. There you go. So Farm Action is a nonprofit organization that works to transform the food and farm system into something that works for everyday people rather than a handful of powerful corporations. And to do that, we conduct independent research, we have policy development, we run advocacy campaigns, and offer political expertise to shift power from the hands into the hands of people all along the food supply chain, from farmers to workers and to all of us who eat. So just a couple examples. We helped to write the White House executive order on promoting competition in the American economy. We developed legislation. A few bills in Congress right now that we helped contribute to are the Farm System Reform Act, the Climate Stewardship Act, and Protect American Meatpacking Workers Act. And what I'm here today to do is to share a recent research project that focused on dismantling the dominant narratives that support corporate consolidation and industrial agriculture, and how you can get involved and help change this narrative. So the Farm Bill comes around once every 5 years, and it is a huge opportunity to make changes to our food and farm system. And right now, we've found time and time again that we've tried to shift government support away from industrial agriculture and toward a more resilient, equitable food system. But we keep failing because big agriculture controls the narrative surrounding the agricultural policy debate. So we've been looking and gearing up for this Farm Bill for several years now, and we believe the first place to start is exposing how industrial agriculture props up their business models by externalizing costs onto people like us and using a well-funded advertising and lobbying campaigns that perpetuate myths that their system is the only way forward. So for decades, these myths have persuaded policymakers that there's no alternative to our current consolidated food system. And my goal today is to arm you all with the information you need to help change this narrative. Okay. So just to start, I want to touch on a few basic premises that we operate from in our lens so that we're all on the same page before we dive in deeper. So consolidation in the food industry has reached a point to where the top 4 firms in almost every sector have acquired abusive levels of power. Just to give you a little perspective on this chart, economists say that when the top 4 firms control more than 40% of the market, abuses are likely. Well, as you can say, and this is actually a slightly old chart, we now need to update chicken processing should be up at 60% thanks to a recent merger. But you can see these levels, we're up to 85% in beef processing, but salty snacks, soft drinks, all of these industries are controlled by just a handful of corporations. And this corporate control has allowed the top firms to reap record profits, paying lower prices to farmers who produce our food and charging higher prices to consumers on the retail end. This influence also gives these companies undue power over our policymaking process. A handful of corporations ultimately control who farms, how they farm, and who gets to eat. Okay, so when we talk about industrial agriculture, what are we talking about? Well, we define industrial agriculture as corporate-controlled system that relies on extractive, mechanized food production practices that prioritize excessive profit above people, animals, and the environment. Today, our government, through farm subsidies, promotes continued consolidation of our food system through industrial agricultural practices. So as a result of government policies and programs supported by the largest food corporations, today many farmers find themselves either raising feed grains, corn, and soybeans that support large meat companies like Pilgrim's Pride or Tyson, or they find themselves raising livestock or poultry for those companies as contract growers. And we explain this vicious cycle in what we call the feed meat complex. So if you look at it, you can see that we have these mandatory checkoff funds that producers who sell into the commodity markets have to pay, and these funds get funneled right into the pockets of big ag lobby, which is also getting funded by corporate profits from these commodity sales. And the big ag lobby pushes for government subsidies to be increased that increase the production, this overproduction of grain that's funneled into livestock feed, which then just which increases the U.S. meat production profits, and it's the self-propelling cycle. And so that's why we look down the chain of 5, 6 recent farm bills, and this cycle is just sort of further and further entrenched itself. And we have an opportunity in the upcoming 2023 Farm Bill debate to change this cycle and focus on producing food, not feed. So just to really hammer this home, the Farm Bill cycle, after Farm Bill cycle, industrial agriculture has continued to further entrench itself into the very center of our food system through these two different mechanisms that sort of interplay with each other. One, the externalization of true cost of production, and two, this by controlling the narrative through an aggressive myth-based marketing campaign. So let's take a moment just to talk about this concept of what I mean when I say externalizing their costs. So by dominating our food and farm system, industrial agriculture has influenced policy so dramatically that they're no longer responsible for vast swaths of their production expenses. There we go. So these costs are numerous and wide-ranging, and this is a glimpse at some of them, but is by no means comprehensive. But they go for anything from increasing road maintenance expenses that result from nonstop tractor-trailer traffic on roads from industrialized operations, to drinking and recreational water contamination, or to large-scale generational shifts in worker wage and safety standards. It's just this overwhelming list of environmental, labor, taxpayer, public health, and retail cost burdens that they've externalized. But these expenses must be accounted for somewhere, and they're eventually picked up by producers, consumers, and taxpayers. And what's really important to note is that the burden of these costs falls disproportionately onto socially disadvantaged communities. A recent report found that while U.S. consumers spend $1.1 trillion on food each year, the true cost, which takes into account the impact of industrialized food production and that impact on the environment, human health, and workers, and more, is actually 3 times that amount and must be paid in the form of subsidies, healthcare costs, and repairs to ecological disasters. So that means, just let me think about that for a second. These industrial operations are actually only accountable for 1/3 of their operational expenses right now. And meanwhile, compare that with independent farmers and ranchers who are far more likely to bear all their cost of production, giving industrial agriculture a leg up in the marketplace. So take, for example, grass-fed producers. Yesterday at the roundtable, I heard from several producers who struggle to compete economically in the market against commodity-fed cattle. Well, why is that? It's because grass-fed beef isn't subsidized the way corn-fed is. And so you're not on an even playing ground. So, producers struggle and they feel like, I've got to figure out how to make my operation more efficient, or how come, I can't, why is this always this uphill battle? Well, it's stacked against you is why. And corporations openly acknowledge that the externalization of these costs is essential to their business models. Every time you breathe a word about new regulation, industry pushes back, and regulations that would attempt to hold them accountable for just an element of their operation. We hear back from the industry about why such regulations would be too costly and how they would lead to higher consumer food prices. But what they neglect to talk about is that many of these regulations are actually serving to level the playing field between industrial agricultural models and alternatives. So if industrial agriculture was held accountable for its true production costs, it wouldn't be economically competitive with independent farmers and ranchers. But we would, you never could hear, all we hear about instead is that, these models of efficiency are super hyper efficient, and without them, we're all gonna starve. And so that's where the second piece comes in. Big Ag knows this. And so instead of altering these wealth extracting supply chains, industrial agricultural interests have chosen to spend billions of dollars on lobbyists whose work perpetuating falsehoods has become so pervasive that it has convinced consumers and policymakers alike that there is no other option. So today, I'm going to try to arm you with some of the tools you need to dispel and dismantle these myths. Okay, so let's start. I kind of touched on this with one that we've all heard, which is that we need these models, industrialized models, to feed the world. Well, because international farm output is rising, there's this assumption that the US agriculture must be responsible for feeding other countries. This is a myth. What we raise is feed for animals, not food for people. The feed-meat complex that I described earlier dominates the majority of US ag production. Current US exports aren't going to those nations with the highest levels of hunger and food insecurity, such as those found in Africa or South America or the Middle East. Instead, they're going primarily to developed and rapidly developing nations whose growing economic middle classes can afford to pay global market prices for meat. We consider ourselves in the US as an agricultural powerhouse, and yet why is it that in 3 of the last 4 years, we've reported an agricultural trade deficit? This means we're actually importing more agricultural products than we're exporting. Our farm system has put so many resources into supporting this feed-meat complex and this growing grain export industry that we can no longer feed ourselves and are growing increasingly dependent on countries like Mexico to feed us. And we're, in the meantime, we're still importing meat from other countries and allowing them, as long as they come in through a USDA facility, we're stacking a product of the USA label on it. So who is feeding the world? Well, it's actually not that complicated. It turns out that 70 to 80% of the world is already fed by independent small farms. And further analysis has shown that these farms could double or even triple their production without resorting to industrial agricultural models. Hold on, there you go. So here's another myth that is, I think, probably most folks at this conference have had to confront at some point in their career or another, which is that there's no alternatives. So the vast majority of the public don't believe there are viable alternative systems. We saw the pandemic help to highlight some of our more regional regenerative food production systems, but the majority of the public think of these as niche operations. They might be too expensive or inaccessible or not, really only interest to a small group of foodies. It's hard for people. People don't believe that there's systems in place that, if given the same level of opportunity and support that industrial ag models, that could provide truly viable alternatives for both producers and consumers. Systems that would both feed and support our communities. But the problem with our farm system right now is it's funneling the bulk of its support towards this one singular industrialized model. And that's why that has become our dominant production model, not the other way around. Meat packers have secured cheap animal feed through subsidized production of corn and soybeans, and conservation program funding is being consumed by manure management for large-scale CAFOs. If alternative systems were given the same level of support that industrialized models receive, they would not only be competitive, but they would have an opportunity to become the dominant production system. All right, And one more myth I wanted to go over today with you, because this is very relevant today, is this idea that we need industrial agricultural to keep retail food prices affordable. So today, as we are all acutely aware, food prices have soared. They're higher, and they've soared faster than inflation. And they've soared even faster in the most consolidated industries like meat, dairy, and snack foods. Meat, the last time I checked, meat and poultry and eggs were up 16%, and that number is rising so quickly that we're updating this figure on a weekly basis these days. Meanwhile, food insecurity rates are skyrocketing, while corporations are having their best year since 1950, with post-tax profits up 35%. 53% of these price increases are driven by profit margin gains. So over the past 50 years, our food system has undergone a period of intense consolidation. And so now what we're left with today are corporations who wield unchecked power with only a handful of corporations dominant in each industry. There's just no competition left to stop rampant price gouging and collusion. How else can you explain record high food prices, record low farmer share of consumer dollar in the face of record high profit margins for corporations? So we have a report called the Truth Report out, and we have a blog series called our Mythbuster blog series that goes into a few more dominant myths that we've identified. And those are myths like industrial agriculture is inevitable, industrial agriculture's practices are harmful to public health, industrial agriculture is climate smart and environmentally sound, industrial agriculture supports rural economies. And I don't probably have time to go into all those today, but I'd be happy to talk to anyone about them after this or at the roundtable, or check out our blog series. Because I did want to take some of this time to talk about the Farm Bill, which is coming right around the corner. And the Farm Bill, as I mentioned, it's a huge opportunity. There's a lot of things we can do, but right now this is a big, big moment in the Farm Bill cycle because it comes around once every 5 years, and really after the election, this midterm election that is on Tuesday, we're going to enter into the prime time for these conversations. You know, everyone's going to know who's going to be running in charge, and all the bills are, all the negotiations are going to start. And this is when you really need to be hounding your representatives. The Farm Bill it creates the whole skeletal structure of our food and farming system. It's not just, and it shouldn't just interest producers. I'm also, when I'm not at Farm Action, I'm a vegetable grower, and it never occurred to me to pay any attention to the Farm Bill before I got into advocacy work because I felt like the programs that came out of it didn't apply to me, but that doesn't have to be the case. It should apply. We should see our food and farm system lifting up all of our producers, and this is the opportunity to do that. If you eat food, this bill impacts you. Everybody should be paying attention to it. And so this is just the time, you can tune out again for another 4.5 years after this, but this is really a good time to pay attention to it. With that in mind, at Farm Action, we have re-envisioned a farm bill that works for everyone, for producers, for consumers, for food system workers, for our farming communities, and not just a handful of corporations. So we've broken this vision down into 4 pillars, which together will lead to the kind of food and farming system that we can all benefit from. So the first pillar, food not feed, we advocate for farm support programs to shift their focus away from the support for feed for intensive livestock and poultry production and toward diverse production of nutrient-dense foods for human consumption. And I'm going to fly through this because I'm running out of time, so you guys can see all that. But we're going to get a little bit more into that. So we're in this huge health epidemic right now. Dietary obesity-related conditions are the leading cause of preventable premature death, and yet we know everyone needs to be eating more fruits and vegetables, but we only put 4% of our farm support programs towards fruit and vegetables. Meanwhile, livestock production models I'm talking about feed, I'm talking about cheap exports, they get, somewhere between 30 and 60% of our subsidies. So this pillar is really focused on shifting these programs away from the commodity feed crops and towards producers who are raising diverse production models of food for their communities. The other 3 pillars, we're going to go super quick, are justice for all, which we really focus and address the USDA's systemic history of racism that has driven brown and black farmers off the land at frightening rates. Just to give you a quick idea, in 1920, 14% of US farmers were black. Today, that number is at 1.7%. So we really are pushing for investment in our socially disadvantaged communities, as well as increasing equitable access, worker protection standards. The third pillar, build local, eat local, is focused on building up and strengthening our local and regional food systems. This means we need to strip corporations of their excessive market power while simultaneously investing and building into our local and regional food supply systems so that they work for everybody. And our fourth pillar, conservation and regeneration, we talk about where in this we really are pushing for these kinds of practices to become the dominant practice, and to do that, we really focus on tying these kinds of practices to our farm support program. So things like you shouldn't be eligible for disaster relief unless you are practicing practices that will make you more resilient in the face of disaster relief, and stop, not contribute to factors that are increasing, that are contributing and driving these increased rates of big extreme weather events. So let's just talk real quick about how you advocate. Get in touch with your representatives. It doesn't matter find out if they're on the Ag Committee. The Senate or House Ag Committee members have a lot of influence and input on who writes the Farm Bill. These are, in the South, in the Southwest here, some representatives that might be yours who are on the Ag Committee. Even if they're not on the Ag Committee, that's fine. They may not even have opinions then on these various ag issues and need to hear from you because they're not hearing from that many people on it. So it only takes a handful of calls to them to really get them to move on some of these issues. And at Farm Action, I don't know if you mind just clicking on that link. We have a bunch of resources to help you talk to your representatives. We've got on our landing page, we have a primer available that if you just want to learn about the Farm Bill before you call, really breaks it down for you. We also have a handbook that outlines all of our policy recommendations, and with a click of the button, you can send that handbook to your representative. The other thing you can do is we've got a toolkit on there, and maybe just go to the website. I don't know if the internet works well enough here to load it, but you can download our toolkit. It's unbranded. You can put your own organization on it. You can edit it. You can send it. You can do whatever you want with it. It's just there for you to use and as however is helpful. So yeah, that's I think the conclusion of I think I'm out of time, but thanks for inviting me here, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Sarah. Lynn, do we have any virtual audience questions right now? None right now, so we'll take one. This is going to be a real quick round, so all the way in the back. You're making it fun for me. Okay. Oh, Hannah, you would.
Thank you. That was so great. Thank you so much for that presentation. I just wondered, what are the pros and cons and things to look out for as conventional industrial ag gets excited about regenerative and climate smart? And there was a little bullet point on there about demanding more transparency with these climate initiatives. So yeah, big corporations getting involved in regenerative on one hand, oh, that sounds good, let's scale it up. On the other hand, so what are the things to look out for?
I would look out for everything as far as their involvement in regenerative. They have a pretty strong proven track record of co-opting labels. A big campaign we have is in label integrity. I love the concepts behind regenerative practices, but without it being a clearly defined standard, it really is leaving it vulnerable right now. Look at what's happened with product of the USA, which actually has a standard. It's just really weak. You know, American producers are struggling to compete because we can import meat, we can import beef and pork products. The packers can put them through a packing facility, and they can slap a made in product of the USA label on it, and it's, you know, suddenly you're competing against Brazilian beef, and it's a different market, different regulations. So, yeah, you know, I would say the way to really implement a strong shift towards regenerative practices should not be industry-led. It should be led by independent producers. Yeah.
So my husband and I are small ranchers. I agree with absolutely everything you've said. Here's one thing I'm wondering. What's going to happen to all the people who are raising grain for feed if we somehow, out of some miracle, succeed in changing the Farm Bill?
I'm so glad you asked that question because I had to fly through that in my presentation. But we are a farmer-led organization. This is not an overnight transition. This is a really long-term shift. One of our top priorities in our Farm Bill campaign is implementing transition programs. That means technical assistance. That means infrastructure. That means access to equipment. You're asking. It's not such an easy, as you said, it's not an overnight shift for farmers who have been raising corn and soy rotations for generations now to just, it's not an overnight flip, and so we need to support them in that transition. We also need to also create markets for them. So things like USDA using its procurement capabilities to lift up these producers and give them access to markets while these markets are still developing. The programs like that are equally important.
So I have a two-pronged question just about the idea of subsidies in general, but do you think that we should be subsidizing agriculture in this amount? And I mean, I understand food has to be affordable for all, but do you think we should be subsidizing it in this a large amount from the federal level? And if so, how do we protect that money to actually go to the right people? Because a lot of times, even if it is well-intentioned, the wrong people end up taking that money and it kind of gets siphoned off, and we end up in this corrupt system that we currently have with our agriculture.
Yeah, another great question, a big question. I would say that yes, today, as we are today, we need to support our farm system. It needs supports to keep food, accessible. When we talk about this re-envisioned farm and food system, this is going to involve a lot of various levels of supports. Also, farming is a risky business, and in order to cultivate generations of farmers, we don't live in the same world we do today. You can't access credit without crop insurance, and so we need to make sure there are crop insurance programs that are accessible to farmers so that they can access the kind of credit they need to keep their businesses running. But you do need to be careful about that. So things like payment limitations are really important. Things that, in the Farm Bill, we're really protective of the definition of actively engaged in farming. These terms, it also comes into, as far as we talk about socially disadvantaged farmers. Whatever you call, these definitions in legislation are critically important. We saw that come up in Black farmer debt relief debacle. I mean, you have to be really intentional when writing legislation and put in those protections for sure.
And unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions with Sarah, though she is doing a roundtable later this afternoon if you want to join her. Can we get a round of applause for Sarah Carden?